"I need a wife by tomorrow," the Duke said. She whispered, "Then you need to promise me these things." There is a kind of silence that isn't peace. It's a child in a room full of servants who don't know how to reach her, a father who has run out of ways to fix what grief has broken, and a house that has forgotten the sound of its own name being called. Somewhere tonight, a woman who thinks her life is already decided is about to be handed a choice no one should have to make in the space of a single evening, and whatever she chooses, there will be no undoing it by morning. She doesn't know yet what it will cost her to say yes. She doesn't know what it will cost her more to say no. But someone in that house has already decided who they trust, and it isn't who you'd expect. Stay till the end, because the person who thinks this story is about a marriage is wrong. Mary Darcy was closing the shutters on the lending shop when a duke walked in and asked her to marry him before morning. She did not scream. She did not drop the ledger in her hand, though her fingers tightened around its spine hard enough to leave a crease. She simply looked at him, tall, dark-coated, hollow around the eyes, in the particular way of a man who had not slept properly in months, and thought, absurdly, that he had chosen a strange hour to lose his mind. Stay with this one, because it does not slow down from here. Say that again, she said. I need a wife by tomorrow. Edward Vale, Duke of Velmore, did not blink when he said it, which told her more than the words themselves. A man performing madness stammers. A man who has run out of every other option says it plainly, because plainness is all he has left. Mary set down the ledger. She walked past him, turned the lock on the shop door, and drew the curtain over the front window with the same unhurried hand she used every evening, as though a duke demanding marriage were simply the last customer of the day and not the strangest sentence she had heard in 11 years of quiet living. Sit, she said, nodding toward the back room. He hesitated. She understood why. A man who commanded a county was not accustomed to taking instruction inside his own borders, let alone from a woman who sold penny novels and mended ledgers for the vicar. But he followed her, because, she would learn later, he had nowhere else to go, and no one else left to ask. She closed the door behind them and folded her hands the way she once folded them in front of a classroom that needed certainty more than comfort. Before I answer anything, Your Grace, you will tell me the truth, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story. He sat as if the chair had been waiting for him to fail in it. For a long moment he said nothing, and she watched the muscles along his jaw work, as though the words cost him something physical to release. My wife is dead 8 months, he said finally. My daughter has not spoken a full sentence since the funeral. Something behind Mary's eyes sharpened, though her face did not change. She had trained that stillness into herself, the way other women trained their posture. Her name is Anne. She is 6. His voice picked up speed now, as though having begun, he could no longer control the pace of it. She does not cry. She does not laugh. She sits in rooms and watches doors, as if waiting for someone who will not come back. He paused, and something crossed his face that looked almost like shame. Her mother's family has decided her silence is proof I cannot raise her. Proof for what purpose? There is a clause in the marriage settlement. He said it the way a man recites a sentence handed down in court. My late wife's trustees have authority to remove Anne to her maternal relations if they judge the household lacks, in their words, proper feminine guidance. They meet tomorrow morning. If I cannot present them a respectable duchess, A woman of established character in the household. They will take her." He looked at Mary directly for the first time since sitting down. "This is not a court of law, Miss Darcy. No judge will weigh evidence. It is 4 men in a drawing room deciding whether my daughter belongs to me or to people who have called her grief a defect for 8 months." His hands, resting on his knees, had curled into fists without his noticing. Mary noticed. She noticed everything a man did with his hands when he thought no one was watching, because she had once spent a year not noticing, and the cost of that had followed her ever since. "I am not asking because I admire you from afar," he said. "I am asking because the whole village speaks of your steadiness, and I have run out of mornings to wait for something better." Mary said nothing for a moment. She was thinking of another room, another year, a girl half her age standing at a desk with bruises she'd called clumsiness, and how Mary had told her to sit and finish her letters because there would be time to talk later. There had not been time. The girl had not come back the next day, or the day after that, and by the time anyone went looking was no longer enough. Mary had left teaching 3 months after, and she had not stood in front of a frightened child since, without hearing, beneath her own voice, the silence of a desk that stayed empty. She had built a small, careful life out of lending books and asking nothing of anyone, precisely so she would never again be the adult who waited too long. You already know what she's going to say. What you don't know yet is what it will cost her. Your daughter is not a clause, Your Grace, Mary said, and her voice lost its careful neutrality. She is not a settlement for men who have never sat with her in the dark to argue over. I have heard children discussed as property before. I will not do it again and call it conversation. Edward did not answer at once. Something shifted in his face, as though he had braced for refusal, or worse, for false comfort, and received neither. Then you understand what I am asking. I understand what you are asking, Mary said. I have not agreed to it. She rose, crossed to the small window, and stood with her back to him a moment before turning. If I do this, it will not be a performance, and it will not be silent on my part. You will hear conditions, and you will agree to every one of them before I sign anything. He inclined his head, the closest thing to permission he had left to give anyone that night. Mary sat again and spoke the way she once addressed a room that needed certainty more than comfort. Anne comes before everything. Before your name, before the trustees, before whatever this marriage is meant to solve for you. If there is ever a choice between her welfare and your convenience, you already know which one I will choose. Agreed. Her mother is not to be erased from that house. Not her portrait, not her belongings, not her memory spoken of in front of the child. I will not have Anne taught to forget so that I might be comfortable. Agreed. You will not force her to call you Papa before she is ready, and you will not force her affection toward me. Children are not won by demand. If she comes to either of us, it will be because she chose it, not because we required it of her. His throat moved. Agreed. I will have real authority in that nursery, not the appearance of it. If I say a thing is needed for her, it is done, not debated by your staff, and not debated by your in-laws. Agreed. And there will be no pretense of love for Anne's benefit, Mary said, quieter now. She has already lost a mother. She will not be handed a lie dressed as a family. Whatever this is between us, she will be told only what is true, at a measure she can carry. Edward was silent a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its former edge entirely. I accept every condition, Miss Darcy. I would have accepted them whether you demanded them or not, though I confess I hadn't thought to put them into words until you said them aloud." He looked at her with something that was not yet trust, but was no longer simple desperation either. "I can secure a special license tonight. We would need to marry before the trustees convene." Mary felt the full weight of what she was agreeing to settle over her, like a coat too heavy for the season. She thought of a girl who never came back, and of a 6-year-old somewhere in a cold house, watching doors. "Then we marry in the morning," she said, "and you will not waste another hour pretending this is anything other than what it is." He rose. For the first time that evening, something in his shoulders eased, however slightly. Outside, the village had gone dark and quiet, unaware that before the sun rose again, a schoolmistress who had once failed to act in time would stand in front of strangers and promise to do, this time, exactly what she had not done before. She did not sleep, neither, she suspected, did he. The marriage took 11 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no gathered well-wishers pressing close to admire a bride. Only a clergyman roused before dawn, 2 witnesses pulled from the kitchen staff, and a special license still faintly smelling of ink. Mary wore the same gray dress she had closed her shop in the evening before, having had no time and no wish to dress as though this were a wedding rather than the settling of an emergency. Edward wore the look of a man signing a contract he had not had time to read twice. When the clergyman asked them to repeat their vows, Mary's voice did not waver, but it carried none of the softness brides were meant to offer. She spoke the words the way she once recited lessons to children who needed certainty, not warmth. Edward matched her, plain, unadorned, his eyes fixed on her rather than the clergyman, as though he needed to watch her mean it. There was no kiss, only a long look between 2 people who understood exactly what they had agreed to and exactly what they had not. No breakfast. No toast. Edward simply paid the clerk his fee, folded the certificate into his coat, and asked if she was ready to leave, as though this were the next item on a long list of urgent tasks. Mary found she did not mind the absence of ceremony. She had not married for ceremony. She had married because a child in a cold house needed an adult who would not vanish, and the vows, bare as they were, had been a true accounting of that, rather than a lie dressed in lace. By 8 o'clock, they were in the carriage to Velmore, neither speaking, the silence between them not unkind, but heavy, with everything still ahead. By 9, they stood before the trustees, and Mary understood, the moment she crossed that threshold, that the wedding had been the easy part of the morning. The room was cold despite the fire. 4 men sat behind a long table, papers arranged before them like evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict before either of them walked in. They asked her why she had married so quickly, whether she understood the duties of a duchess, whether she believed herself capable of raising a child of rank she had met only the day before. Mary did not soften her answers to please them. "I did not marry for romance," she said, "and I will not insult this room by pretending otherwise. A grieving child does not need a performance of affection. She needs steadiness. She needs adults who do not vanish the moment a responsibility becomes difficult." One trustee exchanged a glance with another, unsettled by a woman who offered no tears and no charm, only a flat accounting of what a frightened child required. But her plainness left no room to accuse her of scheming, and after a long, reluctant silence, they agreed. Anne would remain at Velmore under her father's roof, The new Duchess, installed as guardian, in fact, as well as name. One man did not hide his displeasure. Lord Ashcombe, Anne's maternal uncle, had arrived expecting to leave with his niece, her inheritance settled comfortably in his own hands by nightfall, having spent 8 months insisting that a household run by a grieving widower was no place for a delicate child. Instead, he watched a stranger walk away, with both the child and the trust of the room. As the trustees gathered their papers, his eyes followed Mary with the attention of a man already composing his next argument, already turning her overnight marriage into evidence of ambition rather than urgency. A woman married overnight, he said, to no one in particular, loud enough to be heard. Married for a title she did not earn, to a child she does not know. Mary heard him. She did not turn. She had learned long ago that some battles were not won by answering the first insult, only by surviving long enough for the truth to outlast it. Ashcombe watched her go. He was not finished. She could feel it the way you feel, weather changing before the clouds arrive. She climbed the nursery stairs that afternoon alone, having asked the housekeeper to let her go in without ceremony or announcement. The child sat very still in a chair too large for her, hands folded with a stiffness no 6-year-old should have learned, dark hair pulled back so neatly it looked as though someone had tried, in the only way they knew how, to keep some order in a world that had stopped making sense. She did not rise when Mary entered. She simply studied her, the way one studies a stranger who has walked uninvited into a room that used to be safe, cataloging every detail as if searching for the lie she expected to find. "Are you here to replace my mother?" Her voice was flat, already braced for the answer to be a lie, dressed up as kindness, the way so many adults had dressed their lies in the months since the funeral. Mary did not answer quickly, and she did not answer from across the room. She crossed the floor slowly, giving the child time to watch her approach, and knelt so they were level, so that nothing in her posture suggested authority or pity. "No," she said, "no one can replace a mother who was loved. I would not try. I would not insult her by pretending I could." Anne's expression did not visibly change, but something behind her eyes shifted, faint as a held breath finally released halfway. The smallest loosening in a child who had spent 8 months bracing for every adult to disappoint her in the same tired way. It was the first sentence anyone had given her since the funeral that had not asked her to feel differently than she felt. Mary said nothing further. She had learned, in another classroom, in another year, with another frightened child, that some did not need to be filled with words. They needed to be believed. If you think the hardest part of this house is behind her, you have not met Lord Ashcombe yet. That evening, Mary asked that the portrait of the late Duchess remain exactly where it hung in the nursery, refusing the housekeeper's quiet offer to remove it for her comfort. "It stays," Mary said, before the woman could finish the offer. "It is the only mother Anne has, and I will not be the reason she loses sight of her face." She brought Anne a small wooden box with a brass lock and a single key on a ribbon, and told her it was hers alone, to keep whatever of her mother's things she wished to protect from being lost, given away, or quietly tidied out of the house by well-meaning hands. Anne took it without speaking, turning it over once in her lap, running a finger along the seam of the lid, as though testing whether this, too, was a promise that might later be broken. But she held it the way a person holds something they have been afraid to ask for, and that evening she carried it to her room without letting it leave her arms. From the doorway, unseen, Edward watched and understood, for the first time since his wife's death, that his daughter's silence had never been stubbornness. It had been guardianship. She had been standing watch over the only pieces of her mother she had left, certain no adult around her would think to help her keep them safe, certain that if she once let her guard down, even those small things would be taken from her too. Mary had understood this within a single hour. He had lived beside his daughter's grief for 8 months and missed it entirely. The first weeks were hard, in a way that had no single moment to point to, only a long accumulation of small refusals. Anne would not come down for lessons unless fetched twice. She would not look at Edward across the breakfast table, choosing instead to study her plate as though it required her full attention. She spoke to Mary only when speech was unavoidable, answering in the fewest words she could manage, as if every sentence given freely was a coin she could not afford to spend. Mary did not chase her. She had learned long ago that children failed by adults do not trust the ones who arrive eager to be loved, only the ones who simply stay, day after day, asking for nothing in return. So she built a routine instead of a courtship. Breakfast at the same hour, lessons after, a walk in the garden when the weather allowed, an hour of quiet reading before the light failed, and always, without fail, a space left open in the evening for Anne to speak of her mother if she wished. Never hushed, never redirected toward something more cheerful. At first, Anne said nothing in that space. She simply sat with her hands folded, watching Mary, the way one watches weather, waiting to see if it would turn. Slowly, almost without seeming to test anything at all, Anne began testing whether Mary would stay. She left her shoes by the door instead of carrying them upstairs, a small carelessness that asked whether anyone would scold her for it. She came down to breakfast a few minutes late, watching from the doorway to see if Mary would still be there, plate already set, as though lateness might be allowed without consequence. She asked once, almost too quietly to hear, whether Mary intended to leave when her father grew tired of her. Mary answered without flinching that she had not married to be discarded, and that Anne would not wake one morning to find her gone. Anne did not respond, but the question itself, asked aloud rather than carried silently, was its own kind of progress. The first crack in a wall, built to keep disappointment from reaching her twice. Edward tried too hard, in the way men do when guilt has made them clumsy. A porcelain doll from the village, then a set of paints, then a small gray pony he had arranged to have stabled before he'd thought to ask whether she even wanted one. Each gift offered with a forced brightness that did not suit him, a smile held too long on a face unused to performing warmth. And each time, Anne accepted the gift with a quiet thank you, and then withdrew further, as though the gift itself were a debt she had not asked to owe. Mary watched this happen twice before she said anything. The third time, after Edward returned from the village with a length of ribbon he clearly hoped might make Anne smile, Mary followed him into the study and closed the door. "She does not need ribbons," Mary said. "She needs you to stop trying to buy back 8 months in a single afternoon." His jaw tightened, the old reflex of a man unused to correction. "I am trying." Trying is not the same as understanding what she needs. Mary did not soften it. Guilt is not parenting, Your Grace. It is a performance for your own comfort, dressed up as generosity for hers. She can tell the difference, even if you cannot. The words landed harder than she'd intended. She did not take them back. Edward stood very still. When he spoke again, the defensiveness had gone out of his voice. "Then tell me what she needs." "Patience," Mary said, "not performance. Sit with her, without expecting anything back. Let her ignore you, Let her be unimpressed. That is not failure. That is a child deciding, in her own time, whether you are safe. He listened badly at first, returning the ribbon to his pocket, but still hovering too close, still watching Anne's face for approval she was not yet ready to give. But slowly, over the following days, he learned to sit nearby without speaking, to offer nothing and ask for nothing. Mary noticed his respect for her had deepened precisely because she had refused to flatter him, because she had told him the truth when every instinct in him had wanted comfort instead. She thought that meant the worst of it was behind them. She was wrong. The winter fever came without warning, the way illness always seemed to arrive in that house, choosing the coldest night to take hold. Anne's forehead burned by midnight. By 1, she was murmuring in her sleep, calling for her mother, in a voice thinned by fever, asking why no one would answer her. Edward stood frozen in the nursery doorway, the color draining from his face, as though the sound of his daughter calling for a woman who could never come back had undone something he'd spent 8 months holding together. "This is my fault," he said, his voice breaking. "If I had been here from the start." Mary did not let him finish. Not now, sharp enough to cut through the spiral before it could take him entirely. Guilt will not cool her skin. Send for the physician. Bring water, and more clothes than you think we'll need. Sit beside her and stay awake. Be useful, Edward, or leave the room. It was the first time she had used his name without the title attached. Something in the bluntness of it seemed to steady him, more than comfort could have. He went. He returned with water before she'd finished asking. He sat through the long hours of the night, with a cloth pressed to his daughter's forehead, flinching every time she called for her mother, but staying exactly as Mary had ordered, because staying was the only thing left within his power. Mary did not leave either. She managed the physician when he arrived near 3, kept her own voice low and even, so that even in her fever, Anne might hear steadiness rather than panic surrounding her. By morning, the fever broke. Anne's eyes opened slowly, clearer than they'd been in hours, and the first thing she saw was her father still sitting beside the bed, exactly where he had been all night, his shirt creased, his eyes red from exhaustion he had refused to acknowledge. She did not call him Papa. She was not ready for that. But she reached out without being asked and let her small hand rest in his. Edward sat perfectly still, as though afraid any movement at all might cause her to take it back. The household began changing in small, unannounced ways, none of them dramatic enough to mark with a date, all of them noticed only in hindsight. Anne allowed Mary to sit beside her in the evenings while she read, no longer retreating to the far end of the room, sometimes leaning her shoulder against Mary's arm without seeming to realize she had done it. Edward began joining them in the nursery after supper, not as an intrusion, but as a quiet presence in the corner chair, and the room did not grow stiff with his arrival the way it once had. He learned to ask Anne about her drawings rather than her feelings, to comment on the goats in the garden rather than the empty chair at the table where her mother used to sit. And slowly, Anne began answering him in full sentences. Then, occasionally, in sentences that carried something like warmth. Mary said little about the change. She simply continued the routine she had built from the first week, never announcing the progress for fear of frightening it away. But she felt her own guard loosening too, in ways she had not planned for and did not entirely trust. 3 months in, she still told herself this was a household she was managing, not a home she belonged to. She was about to learn how wrong that was, and how little it would matter to Lord Ashcombe. He returned with the trustees gathered once more around the same long table, and this time he had come prepared. He argued that Mary was a rushed duchess, a woman of convenience installed overnight with no true claim on the child's affection, and that Edward had married her not from genuine concern for Anne's welfare, but simply to block her maternal family from the influence that was rightfully theirs. A marriage formed in a single evening, Ashcombe said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had rehearsed the line in front of a mirror more than once, cannot be mistaken for a household built on years of trust. I ask the trustees to consider whether Anne would not be better served among her mother's own blood, where her grief might be understood by those who shared it, rather than left in the care of a woman who married a stranger before the ink on her own widowhood papers had dried. The trustees turned to Mary. One asked, not unkindly but directly, why she had truly married a stranger overnight, and whether she could honestly claim any bond with the child beyond the convenience of a title. Mary did not dress her answer in anything softer than the truth. I married because a child was being discussed as property by men who had never once sat with her in the dark, she said. I will not pretend that was love, it was not. But I did not leave when the danger passed, and I have not stayed for a title I never wanted. I stayed because Anne became dear to me in ways I did not expect and cannot undo. The room went quiet after she spoke. Ashcombe's mouth tightened, sensing her honesty had cost her nothing and given him nothing to seize upon. No contradiction, no performance he could expose as false. He had expected a woman who might crumble under direct questioning, or one so practiced in flattery her answers would ring hollow. Instead, he faced a woman who admitted exactly what was true, and exactly what was not. It was Anne, brought into the room at the trustee's request, who settled what argument remained. One trustee knelt slightly to her level and asked, gently, where she felt safest, careful to keep his voice free of pressure. Anne did not look to her father for guidance, nor to Mary, though both stood near enough to touch. She answered, as though she had already considered the question long before anyone thought to ask it aloud. Velmore, she said, because that is where Mama's things are kept safe, and no one has ever tried to take them from me there. She paused, glancing once at Mary before continuing. Mary tells me the truth, even when it is not the answer I want. And Papa stays even on the days I am angry at him and do not want him near me. The room went very still. Ashcombe opened his mouth, as though to argue the point further, to suggest the child did not understand what was truly being decided. But no words came. A 6-year-old had answered a question about inheritance and guardianship with nothing more than a plain account of who had been honest with her and who had stayed. There was no clever rebuttal that could survive being weighed against that. Mary felt something tighten in her chest, not triumph exactly, but a quiet ache at hearing herself named, unprompted, as someone who told the truth. Edward's hand found the back of a chair to steady himself, his eyes fixed on his daughter, as though she had just handed him something he had not known he was waiting for. Ashcombe's case, built over months of careful letters and quiet persuasion at dinner tables and private drawing rooms, had been undone in under a minute by a child who had simply told the truth as she understood it. The trustees confirmed, with little further discussion, that Anne would remain at Velmore under her father's roof and Mary's guardianship. Ashcombe left the room without another word, his careful architecture of persuasion reduced to nothing by a child's honest answer. You'd think that would be the end of it. It's the end of Ashcombe's argument. It is not the end of the question Mary still has to answer for herself. That evening, after the house had gone quiet and Anne had been settled to sleep, Edward found Mary in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own since the wedding. He stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking. "I want you to know," he said, "that you are free of this marriage, if it is freedom you want. I will keep every promise I made you that first night. I will not use Anne to bind you to a life you did not choose for yourself." Mary set down the book she had not truly been reading and studied him carefully. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" Edward was quiet longer than the question should have required. When he finally answered, his voice had none of the formal distance it once carried. "No," he said. "I needed a wife by tomorrow. That night in your shop, I did not expect to find a woman who would teach me how to become a father. I did not expect to watch you walk into a house full of silence and make it speak again." He paused. "I am not offering you freedom because I want you gone, Mary. I am offering it because I promised you honesty, and I owe you the truth that the choice is still yours to make." Mary looked at him a long moment, weighing the offer not as an escape, but as the plainest proof yet that he had kept every condition she had set that first night, down to the smallest of them. She had expected, when she agreed to marry a stranger to save a grieving child, that the marriage itself would remain a transaction long after its purpose was served. A quiet arrangement maintained out of obligation rather than feeling. She had not expected to feel, standing in that room with the fire burning low and Edward waiting for her answer, that leaving would cost her something real. "I came for Anne," she said, finally admitting what she had not allowed herself to say aloud until that moment. "I will not pretend otherwise. But I stayed, because this house became something I had not expected to find again, a place that felt like home, rather than a duty I was discharging." Edward crossed the room and took her hand, not as a duke claiming what was owed him, but as a man asking permission with the smallest of gestures. They chose the marriage honestly that night, neither pretending it had begun as anything other than what it was, nor pretending it had remained only that. Months later, on a bright morning, with frost still silvering the chapel windows, they held a small blessing at Velmore. Nothing grand, only family, and the few neighbors who had watched the strange arrangement unfold over the better part of a year. Anne stood between them at the altar, holding a small posy of winter flowers she had chosen herself from the conservatory. She did not call Mary mother during the service, and no one expected her to, least of all Mary, who had promised long ago that no one would ever ask Anne to forget. But during the prayers, when the room fell quiet and the vicar's voice settled into something solemn, Anne reached out and took Mary's hand without being asked, holding it the way she once held the small wooden box containing her mother's ribbons, carefully, as something precious that had earned its place beside her. Edward watched the two of them, his wife and his daughter, joined in the hush of the chapel, and understood that the bargain struck in a closing shop on a desperate evening had become, against every reasonable expectation, a family that had chosen to stay. Mary had never set out to replace anyone. She had only ever meant to do what she had once failed to do, to act before it was too late. In the end, that was enough. She had not become a replacement duchess. She had become the woman who stayed. And if you're wondering whether a promise made in 11 desperate minutes can outlast a year of scrutiny, a fever, and a man determined to prove it never happened at all, you already have your answer. The only question left is whether you'd have had the nerve to set the same conditions Mary did before you ever said, "I will."